Thank you so very much. And it's really a joy to be with you today and to be able to experience and hear the films or YouTubes that you put on the screen. And in fact, several people have been calling for that song that Marvin Gaye sung to be almost like an anthem for what's really going on now. Because after all, mothers are crying and too many of us are dying. And so it is my pleasure to be with you. I want you to realize that the Center for the Healing of Racism have a long history with the Unitarian Church. Our first office was housed at First Unitarian Church on Fannin Street on the second floor. And not only were we housed there, we were able to use several of the larger meeting rooms in order to be able to hold our workshops called Dialogue Racism. But you see, it did not end when we moved away to a college setting. We have been invited by the Unitarian churches all over Houston, in Seabrook, Boca Raton, Florida, and even being in Boca Raton, Florida, I was asked when I returned to do Dialogue Racism if I would give the sermon on that Sunday, and which I did. The Center for the Healing of Racism is an organization that was founded in Houston, Texas. We are housed in Houston, Texas. The work of the center go out across the United States. And we've had the opportunity to work in Canada twice at an international school. And we have also worked in schools as well as with adults in Innsbruck, Austria. Our work has been far-reaching. But what I will say to you now more than any other time, because of what happened in this country on May the 25th, 2020, when George Floyd was lynched by one of the city's finest. And the numbers that we must always remember is 846. That's how long the police officer stood on the neck of George Floyd until he took his last breath, crying and pleading for his mother and making the officers aware, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. For many of us nationwide, we turned on our television sets and right in our homes, we witnessed this terrible event. And once you see it, you can no longer pretend you don't see it. But what happened, it propelled people globally to take to the streets, to march, to make their voices heard. And all of the thousands or millions of protest signs that was used in these marches. And so it gave this country a new beginning, I would say. It gave this country a chance. It gave this country permission to be able to use the word racism. And as George Floyd's little daughter said, my father will change the world. And I will say with all of my heart, The death of her father changed the center for the healing of racism, because we have been busier now than in our entire 31 and a half years. What is also very interesting is that we have longed and waited for this time when people would get real in this country and name it. Name it what it really is, racism. We have played with people's feelings and emotions within houses of worship, within corporate America, within the educational institutions, by our refusal to name it. You see, it was easy for us to say multiculturalism and diversity and insensitive trading, but not to have workshops really around racism. The reason that I know that people are wanting these conversations around racism, because with the work that we have been doing, we have right now over 50 workshops on our calendar, and the year just begun. What is so interesting also is when Barack Obama was elected to the presidency in the United States, people of color, we were very excited because we just knew the truth would be told and that we would have conversations around racism. But you see, that didn't happen. And it wasn't long before we understood the reason that he couldn't call attention to racism is because he would be seen, as we all have been seen when we bring up that word racism, angry Black people. And in studying and reviewing this, that sat so heavily on my heart of not being able to name it, I took the opportunity to write a poem. And it's very interesting what triggers creativity. But someone sent me a postcard of the Statue of Liberty. And on that postcard, the Statue of Liberty had a tear flowing down her face. And I looked at it and I stared at that postcard for the longest time because I understood, and I wrote this poem that I will share with you now. I saw a tear on the face of a statue today. And that tear said more than words could ever say. I tried to look past Miss Liberty's face to search into her soul and learn the many secrets she did hold. She stood tall with book and torch in hand, welcoming all to this great land. The tired, the poor, longing to be free. She said, take refuge in me. She stood silent for over hundreds of years as Americans expressed their negative stereotypes, hate and fears, internment camps, lynchings, defacing of synagogues, racial profiling, cross burnings, lynchings of Black men, just to name a few. All are racist acts that humans do. And when we try to call it racism to give it a name, we are often accused of playing the RACE game. She listened to words that keep us apart. You do not belong here because you are too dark. Go back to where you came from and take your foreign names. She watched in silence as all of her children of color were not treated the same. But when we call it racism to give it a name, we are always accused of playing the RACE game. She saw many Americans rejected by others due to physical features, styles of dress, religion, and culture differently expressed, whether in the name of God, apple pie, American flag, purity of race, or those who just don't know why. Mothers still weep all over the land for the reasons that caused the Statue of Liberty to cry. And still, would we call it racism to give it a name? We are often accused of playing the RACE game. I looked deep into that postcard and that tear, and I knew the reason that Obama could not call that racism. I know that many of our elected officials of color that we have sent to represent us could not use that word. But as I took part in the march, the demonstration here in Houston, Texas, along with 60,000 human beings marching to City Hall from Discovery Green, it was so exhilarating to see the signs, to see the statements that human beings were making. And I looked at so many of those signs that said, stronger together, stop racism. Racism is not patriotic. Stop systemic racism. Say no to racism. Racism is so American that when you protest it, people think you are protesting America, because this was created and this is a racist system. To be able to look at signs that said white silence equals Black death. To look at other signs that said racism is a pandemic in this country. And to see the picture of a young person, a young little white blonde girl holding a sign that said, racism is not born, it's taught. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. I looked at so many and read so many of these signs where people are making a statement and people are naming it. It is my feeling if you can't name it, you will never be able to do anything about it. And for years, that word racism made people so uncomfortable. I've had people say to me, oh, well, why don't you take racism out of your name? And I would say to them, that is not an option. I will never take the word racism out of the name, because I am healing from racism, not multiculturalism. Is that what you want me to replace it with? But on the other hand, so many of us don't really understand what racism really is. And last year in June, a college student by the name of Kennedy Mitchum, this young lady wrote to Merriam-Webster dictionary, and she wanted to call attention to the definition of racism in that dictionary. She said, and I quote, while thousands of people have taken to the street to protest, Kennedy Mitchum, who recently graduated with a degree in law, politics, and sociology, went to the email. She said it all started when people would argue with her about the definition of racism. And she realized the problem was in the pages of that dictionary, Merriam-Webster. With everything going on, I think it's important everyone is on the same page, she said. The dictionary defines racism as a belief that race is the primary deterrent of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Ms. Kennedy said that that definition simply is too surface. And she wrote back and forth to Merriam-Webster's dictionary because she wanted them to include within that definition. She said, basically, I told them that there is a systematic oppression of people. And it's not just like someone, it's a system of oppression for a certain group of people, she explained. And after going back and forth, Merriam-Webster Dictionary agreed that they would, in their upcoming edition, include within the dictionary that whole systematic oppression part of racism. As I said before, many of us, it's hard for us to wrap our mind around racism when we don't truly understand what it is. For most people, they will say, well, I've never told a racist joke. I've never even used the N word, the WB word, the K word, all of these. So I'm all right. But what people don't realize, these are just symptoms of this problem called racism. Racism is a system. It was a system that was institutionalized within this country. It is a system based on prejudice plus power. And that formula equals racism. As I think about what has happened recently, what I think about because of George Floyd, every one of the programs that I watch in the evenings, whether they are comedy or sitcoms, all of the ones that I watch are really now talking about racism and calling attention to racism. I said, and I will say it again, if you can't name it, you can't do anything at all about it. And in looking at a documentary once, the two young women, college students, they were speaking to each other. And the person of African descent looked at her person that she went to the university with. She said, Tammy, I don't blame you for your racial conditioning. And you may not have done one thing wrong, one thing in your life that would be considered racist, but you can't deny the fact that you benefited from it. So when we call attention to white privilege, we are talking not about studying hard or working hard, getting the rewards of your labor, but what we are truly talking about. Because of racism in this country, white-skinned people get a boost up. So if you have white skin or you are made to identify as white, you get that boost up. And many of you have asked the questions over and over again, and I recognize very well because, as I said, I have worked with people of the Unitarian faith as well as had an office in the church building. I can say that I understand your compassion, your empathy. I could understand you wanting peace. And I could understand there are so many of you that want to know what you can do next. And because this is a very short time to be with you, one of the things that I will say to you, remember that poem, The Tear on the Face of a Statue. And whenever a person of color tell you what has been happening to them under the yoke of racism, I will ask you not to question it. I will ask you to believe it. Your not believing it is what have kept this thing in motion all of these years. So if you can do nothing else, believe them. And at the same time, understand that we have a long history of hurt in this country under racism. Not to take it personally if a person of color told you about the conditioning that they received, the oppression, the discrimination under this yoke of racism. Don't take it personal if you haven't done anything that caused it. But I will say to you, not doing anything to cause it isn't enough. What I would like to end with, and many of you, because I've heard your voices before, saying, well, Cherry, you are preaching to the choir. And I will say to you, sing, choir, sing, because you can get into places that my voice will never be welcomed. And with that, again, I say, sing, choir, sing. Thank you so much.